Hello, and welcome to the California Public Utilities Commission's set of materials and toolkit for individuals and members of the public regarding the BEAD challenge process, submitting individual challenges in the BEAD program. My name is Joanne Hovis, and I am part of the contract team that supports the PUC with the BEAD program. What I am going to do today is offer some guidance and information for members of the public, individuals who are interested in learning more about the BEAD program, and in particular about the BEAD challenge process and how individuals can participate in the challenge process. I'm going to start now with an overview of the BEAD program, and in other segments of this toolkit, I will provide an overview of the challenge process. I will provide information about how individuals, members of the public, can play a part in the challenge process in order to submit information about their locations. And then I will provide some detailed guidance about how individuals can submit challenges as part of the challenge process in order to ensure that their locations are accurately reflected on the BEAD map. In addition, I will share next steps for how to go through that process of submitting an individual challenge. But first, let's start with an overview of the BEAD program. To talk about BEAD, which is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program that was created by Congress as part of the IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. To talk about BEAD, we should start by talking about broadband. Why is broadband so important, and what are we talking about when we discuss broadband, and in particular, the challenge process for the BEAD program that is designed to bring new broadband capabilities to addresses throughout California that do not currently have adequate broadband? Well, what's important about this is that speed determines an enormous amount of how internet is used and how useful it is to the users. What you'll see as we talk about the BEAD challenge process is that internet speeds are a critical element and the measure by which the federal government determines whether a location, an address within California and every other state, is considered served or unserved or underserved with regard to broadband internet. Internet speeds are measured in two ways. One is download from the network to the individual user, that is how we receive and consume data over the internet, as well as upload from the individual user up to the network, how we send information that we are generating up to the network to be sent somewhere else. Speeds, both upload and download, are measured using megabits per second. 100 by 20 megabits per second, meaning 100 megabits in the download direction every second and 20 in the upload direction. Or, as another example, 1,000 megabits per second, which is also referred to as a gigabit, in the upload direction, and 1,000 in the download direction would be called a symmetrical gigabit. And speeds are the most important criterion for determining whether broadband exists at a given location, because that is the measure that was set out in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law for determining which locations are eligible for BEAD funding. There are different kinds of broadband technologies that already exist in some places and that will be built under the BEAD program in others. The critical ones to know about are fiber. Fiber is a set of cables that are effectively long strands of glass that allow for the transmission of data through light that traverses the glass strands at very high speeds Fiber is universally recognized by policymakers and engineers as the critical, most future-proof, meaning able to scale to higher and higher speeds in the future technology and the measure of the best technology. The second type of broadband technology of which to be aware is cable infrastructure. And cable is the infrastructure that was originally used for cable television for one-way video, but is primarily these days used for two-way internet over the networks that were built for cable television. Most cable networks will have some fiber in them, but they are still primarily the coaxial cables that were built in the 1970s and 1980s for cable television. Cable networks are quite capable of delivering some very fast speeds depending on how they are configured and maintained. The third type of infrastructure to know about is DSL, or digital subscriber line. These are the wires that are generally copper wires that were originally used for telephone service, in many cases dating back many, many decades, and that are now used for two-way internet service. Because of the age and the type of technology, DSL networks frequently struggle to reach fast broadband speeds, but can quite frequently deliver some lower speed internet service. Finally, the fourth type of technology of which to be aware is fixed wireless. That is to say, not mobile wireless, not the kind of service that follows us around with our smartphones, but rather wireless signals that go from wireless access points on towers or other infrastructure on a fixed basis directly to our homes or offices, delivering fixed service to our homes or our offices over wireless spectrum. And fixed wireless, depending on how it is engineered and what kind of infrastructure it relies on, can deliver fast speeds and in some cases slow speeds, just depends on the network. So with that as background, let's talk about the BEAD program itself. As I said, BEAD is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program created by Congress and signed by the president as part of the IIJA in 2021. Under BEAD, more than $40 billion of federal funding is being distributed to the states, Washington, D.C., and the territories, of which more than $1.8 billion will be coming to California. BEAD is being overseen by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration of the U.S. Department of Commerce and is being managed by the states. In California, that is the California Public Utilities Commission. The goal of BEAD is to expand high-speed internet through infrastructure deployment, and the purpose is to try to get broadband infrastructure to every unserved address throughout America as much as is possible within that budget of $42.45 billion. The BEAD statute lays out priorities for the funding. The first priority and the absolute must for all states to accomplish with their BEAD allocated funds is to deliver service to locations that cannot currently get 25 megabits per second in the downstream direction and 3 megabits per second in the upstream direction. And the BEAD statute calls those locations unserved, and those are the top priority. The second priority is for underserved locations, those that can receive 25 by 3 and above, but cannot go to 100 by 20 or above that. And those locations are known in the language of the BEAD program as underserved, and they are second priority. The third priority for those states whose funds can get to all of the first two priorities and there are still funds left over is for community anchor institutions, which are effectively the places where members of the public receive services: schools, libraries, hospitals, community centers, and the like. In those locations, if they cannot receive a gigabit per second, both in the upstream and in the downstream direction. They are defined as unserved for purposes of community anchor institutions. And if there are funds left over after unserved and underserved, those can be funded as well. These are federal rules for how the funding must be spent. This is not within the discretion of any state. And all states are working within this framework of prioritization as established by the IIJA. In California, as I said, the BEAD program includes more than $1.8 billion. These are funds that have been allocated to California under the statute. And while the CPUC is currently engaged in undertaking the extensive federal planning program that is required, what will be materializing shortly is the actual BEAD execution program based on the plans that have been developed by the CPUC and submitted to NTIA for review and approval. These plans are called the 5-Year Action Plan, the Initial Proposal Volume 1, and the Initial Proposal Volume 2. And one way to understand the timeline for all things related to the BEAD program is that the bulk of BEAD planning happened last year in 2023, with some of it extending into this year. In the middle of this year, the CPUC will undertake the challenge process, which we'll talk about in great detail in the second part of this toolkit recording. And then after that, the actual BEAD grant program late this year and into next year, with deployment then beginning hopefully in 2025 and extending for a number of years beyond that. What is so important about BEAD is that this is simply an unprecedented level of funding. The federal government has never come close to appropriating anything near the $42 billion that are part of the BEAD program, and California's allocation of $1.86 billion of that 42 is one of the highest allocations in the country. So an unprecedented amount of funding with a very ambitious and visionary statutory goal of trying to make sure that every unserved and underserved location will get broadband infrastructure and service over the next few years. What is so important about the current moment is that to prepare for giving out this BEAD funding, the CPUC is going to undertake something called the challenge process. And the challenge process is the means by which the state of California can take the Federal Communications Commission's national broadband map and try to improve on it to make sure that every location in California is accurately reflected on that map, whether it is served, underserved, or unserved, so that the right data are available and so that the CPUC knows which locations are definitely unserved and definitely underserved and can make sure that the funding available is targeted toward those locations. So the challenge process is the means by which the state of California will improve on the FCC's national broadband map to design a map that will determine eligibility for all of that BEAD funding. Once that map is approved, it will be the means by which addresses are made eligible or not, if they are actually served, for last mile broadband infrastructure. The goal being that all of those eligible locations that are truly unserved and underserved will be served through the BEAD program and through the BEAD allocation process.